Hey everyone, Mike here in the BFH Garage, and today's topic is going to be how to change a leaking pinion seal. The process is relatively straightforward, but it is going to differ just a little bit based on whether your axle uses a crush sleeve or a collapsible spacer or whether it uses shims. On my TJ here, I have a high pinion 30 out of a Jeep Cherokee, and the high pinion Dana 30s use shims, which makes it super easy for me. If you have an old TJ or even the JKs now use the collapsible spacers, then that's going to change it up a little bit. But I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So if you've been under your Jeep and you see a lot of oil buildup right around the bottom side of your differential and it kind of covers the snout there a little bit, that is a leaky pinion seal, meaning this seal right here is leaking. And I just replaced this not too long ago, so not sure why it's leaking, but sometimes that happens. You just got to change out, put a new one in. The process for that is relatively straightforward. You just need to remove your drive shaft, remove your pinion nut on the inside there, pull your yoke out, pull the seal out, install a new seal, torque it back to spec, and you're on your way. Now the difference with that is on a high pinion 30 in this case here, so any axle that uses shims, then you torque it down to the factory spec and you're good to go. If you are using an axle, or if you have an axle that uses a crush sleeve, then there's a couple different ways to do it. I'm a proponent of doing it the right way, but I will show you what other people do to get around that. Your mileage may vary though. I have two pinion gears here, and you're gonna notice one has a huge shoulder right here that the bearing comes down, slides up against. The other one doesn't have that type of shoulder, and there's a reason for that. So when you look at the pinion gear on the left here, the one I just stood up, it uses a crush sleeve or collapsible spacer. And the way that works is you put on your head bearing first, and the bearing goes down there and sits. Then you put on your collapsible spacer, and the bottom of this presses up against the bearing. Then you put your tail bearing on over the top of that, and then as you tighten the bearing down, and you have to, man, it takes a lot of torque to get it to go, then what happens is this spacer does exactly what it's called. It starts to collapse in like that. And we're talking thousandths of an inch. You're not going to see it with the naked eye, but what you want to do is you want to get your bearings to close down on each other just enough that you get a certain amount of resistance in your pinion gear, and that's called preload. Why am I telling you that? It's really important because when you change out your pinion seal and you take out your collapsible spacer, these are one-time use. Once you use it, you're pretty much toast with it. Now, we'll give you an option that other people use, but in my opinion, you need to toss it and get a new collapsible spacer. Now, let's go over to the other pinion gear here. Remember, it's got the big old shoulder sitting right there. And same thing kind of occurs here. You put your bearing on, it slides all the way down to the bottom. And then what you do is you throw these little shims on here, and they come down and they rest up on that shoulder. And then you take this bearing, you put it down, and as you tighten the nut on the pinion gear, depending how many shims you have here, you're gonna get the correct preload. If you don't have enough shims, your preload's gonna be too high. If you have too many shims, your preload's gonna be too loose. So you have to keep changing out shims until you get the exact amount of preload that you want. Now with the collapsible spacer, it's different because you just put that on there and you start torquing it down and checking your preload until it is where you want it. So that's relatively simple. You put that on there and you just start tightening it down until you get the preload that you want. Now, I will caution you, these things are easy to over tighten and over crush. So when you're doing that, sometimes the nut on there only needs to turn 1/8 of an inch maybe. So when you start getting close to that, make sure you're using minor adjustments to figure out where you're at with your preload. So we've established that this is in fact a pinion seal leak because it's leaking right around this area here. This is a common pattern, oil pattern coming down that says it's leaking from here. So we need to get the drive shaft off, get the pinion nut off, and that yoke out. So before we pull the seal out, I want you to take a look at the nut. This one here has a built-in flange or a built-in washer, I guess. If you look up real close here, you're gonna see that it looks round there. It used to be deformed. Now the replacement nut that I'm gonna use is actually a separate nut and a washer. Now you need to understand that these are Stover type nuts. Stover's a brand, but these are deformed nuts that when they go on, they bite down and they lock down on your pinion. So if you look real closely there, you're gonna see almost a little bit of a triangular form to that thing. It's definitely deformed. And as you put it onto the stem of the pinion, it clamps down and that's what keeps it from coming off. For the purposes of demonstrating, I just put the pinion yoke back in and finger tighten this nut. I'll be able to explain to you the trick that other people use. So there's two things here. Some people like to reuse their pinion nut. Some people like to reuse their collapsible spacer. You can't really do one without the other. So if you're gonna reuse your collapsible spacer, then you probably need to reuse your pinion nut, and I'll show you why here. What most people will say to do is take a pen and put a mark on the nut here, put a mark here on your yoke. That way you have a reference for when you tighten it up, you want those lines to come back exactly, and that puts the proper amount of preload onto that collapsible spacer. They also tell you make sure you use red Loctite, and I would say definitely do this if you're going to reuse the nut. Put a fair amount of red Loctite on that pinion nut as you're tighten it up, so that way it has less of a chance to come off. I'm going to tell you right now, a collapsible spacer costs $6 or $8, and a new pinion nut's like $5. And the whole thing is, a rear gear job, should this come loose on you and your gears get all jacked up, a re-gear on the front axle alone is going to probably cost you anywhere between $1,000 and $1,500. So you could put in 15 or 20 bucks now and not even worry about it, or you're going to be constantly worrying about it and checking it on a regular basis because you're not sure if it came loose or not. I don't like reusing pinion nuts. I do not like reusing collapsible spacers. Now here's the other reason as well. I've tried this before just on a test, and that is I put the mark here, put it on the yoke, I pull it off, I go to put it back on, and the pinion preload is definitely different, even with the line being marked up directly. Now here's part of the problem you're gonna face. If your nut was installed or your gears were done in the middle of winter, metal shrinks, so your thread turning on the nut is going to be a little bit different. So if you had your gears done in the winter and you're changing out your seal in the summer, the expansion of the heat is going to change everything a little bit as well. So it is very unreliable to try to line up a mark and say, okay, you're good. The downside is, or I'm sorry, the upside is on a front axle, you don't have to worry about it as much as you would on a rear axle. So keep that in mind. My personal preference is use a new collapsible spacer and always use a new pinion nut, and then just recollapse the new spacer to spec. And that means you got to pull your differential out so that way you can turn all this and get it to where you need it. It's a process, but it's the right way to do it. Here, since I have a high pinion 30 that uses shims, all I have to do is take the nut off, get my yoke out, remove the seal, put a new seal in, tighten it right back down to spec, reinstall the drive shaft, and I'm done. So that is a nice thing about shims versus a collapsible spacer. Now, one last thing about that, there's one other way around that, and that is using a crush sleeve eliminator kit. So what they do is they make a solid spacer that takes the place of the crush washer, but they make it just a little bit shallow so you could add shims and treat it the same as if you're doing a shimmed axle. So I think those are worth the money. If you do a lot of off-road and you find yourself having leaky pinion seals, that'll probably be worth it to do it. So let's get this, get moving on and get this pinion seal out. The process to get a pinion seal out is fairly straightforward. So since I'm not pulling out the pinion gear, I can't really get a seal pull in there and get it out. So all you want to do, and you want to make sure you don't scratch the inside of the housing. So you want to put a screwdriver here at a slight angle, and you're going to start collapsing the outside edge of this seal on itself. So if you see here, I'll start tapping, and you'll notice that this starts caving in on itself. So give it up close on that. Once I start tapping it, that starts caving in, and eventually it will become loose enough that you can pull the seal out with a little bit of force. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see or not, but I took this screwdriver, I punched a hole right here, and the purpose of that is I'm gonna get a bigger screwdriver now, I'm gonna force that in there, and then I'm gonna be able to pry this seal out. Works slick and it's really easy. Don't go in too far then, because you got a baffle in there that you don't want to destroy. You don't want to mess up your splines. You just want to get this hole going so you have some leverage. Just like that. And then you can do that and it'll pop right out. After pulling that seal out, I use a brass tipped brush, and that does great for removing that like the gasket stuff that's in there. So make sure you have one that's not worn like mine, and that stuff usually comes off fairly simple. Now, some people take a screwdriver. If you're going to do that, I caution you, you have to be very, very gentle. It works pretty well, but you can damage a surface, and you don't want to do that. So use that very, very lightly. I still strongly suggest using the brass bristle brush first. Try to say that 3 times fast, and then you're good to put your seal back in. Moving on to replacing the seal. I still pack the lip. They put a little bit of grease in there. I still pack the lip just to make sure when that pinion yoke goes through there, it doesn't leak from there. So get it in as straight as you can. And as much as I like to use a BFH, this here is a job for a little ball peen hammer. And you're gonna work around in a little bit of a circle, tap, tap, tap. It may get offset, and you just gotta work it slowly. Now, the thing that I want you to pay attention to, there's a couple different type seals out there. This one here has the gasket maker here, which means this gasket needs to press up against that inner lip there. There's other pinion seals that use the gasket on the outside edge here, and it would seal up against that outside edge. But this one here calls for the style that I'm using. So I'm gonna go ahead and get that pressed in. So one thing that can cause these leaks is on your pinion yoke here, you'll see a really fine line there. These pinion seals, this thing sits there and just turns on it, and they could wear a groove into there, and oil can get by that. So check your yoke, make sure you don't have any major damage on the outside there where it rides up against a seal, and you should be good to go. So putting this back together now is as simple as slowly getting that through the seal. And then I'm going to put on the new washer and nut, tighten it down to spec. And that's it. All right, with that all done, take some brake clean, get all that stuff cleaned up. That way you can see if your pinion's leaking again. So that's all cleaned up. This is bare metal here, so you still want to paint it, give it a coat of something. It doesn't matter what. And just get something on there to protect what's on there. Do the nut, I don't even care. It's your Jeep, do what you want to do. So that's all there is to this job. It seems pretty intimidating. As you can see, it's really straightforward. If you're using that collapsible spacer, that makes it a little bit tougher because you want to make sure that you get your preload right. But even then, it's not a difficult job. I hope this helped you out. If you like it, please subscribe and pass the word. See ya.